A 4-year-old who couldn't speak drew the same picture every day. A house, a chimney, 3 figures close together, and one figure standing far apart, alone in the cold. She drew it over and over, until one day, slowly, carefully, she moved that lone figure closer. Not all the way, not yet, but she drew a line between them, and that line, drawn by a child who had every reason never to trust again, was the beginning of something none of them had expected to find in a Wyoming winter: a family. This channel tells the stories that matter most, of the American frontier. What Emmy's drawing teaches us is what every great story teaches us. Connection is a choice. You draw the line, you move a little closer. And sometimes, that is enough to change everything. If this story touched you, subscribe to this channel, share it with someone who loves a good heart, and leave a comment below. Tell me your city. Tell me what moved you. I read every single one.
Just then, her 7-year-old daughter, Nora, whispered, "Mama, the driver ain't moving no more." Ruth's heart fell. She stumbled out of the coach into a world of white. The driver, Bill Mercer, was frozen solid in his seat, eyes wide open to the storm. He was gone. Back inside the coach, Nora, with eyes far too old for a 7-year-old, asked the question Ruth was dreading. "Is he gone, Mama?" Ruth never lied to her children. "Yes, honey, he is." Nora's next question came out steady as a rock. "Are we gonna die too?" "Not while I'm still breathing," Ruth vowed. She looked at little Emmy, whose shivering had stopped a whole hour ago. Ruth knew what that meant. It was a sign of the body giving up. She ripped open her coat and pressed Emmy's icy body against her own skin, praying for a miracle. "Mama, what do we do?" Nora asked, her voice cutting through the fear. Through the frosted window there was nothing but the storm. But somewhere out there was a ranch, and a man named Jesse Hawkins, a man she had lied to in a letter promising she was all alone. "We walk," Ruth said, her voice firm. "Emmy needs a fire, and she needs it now." She remembered seeing fence posts a ways back. "A fence leads to a home. We're going to follow it." Nora, bless her heart, looked at her little sister's pale face, then grabbed the bag that held all their worldly possessions. "I'll carry the bag." That simple bravery nearly broke Ruth's spirit. She bundled Emmy inside her coat until only a small face was visible, and with Nora gripping the back of her coat for dear life, she stepped out into the howling wind. They moved like ghosts through the blizzard, with Ruth's numb hand on the fence wire, guiding them from one post to the next. Then a scent on the wind. Wood smoke. Hope. A faint yellow light appeared in the distance. A window. "Hello!" Ruth screamed into the storm, but the wind just swallowed her words. She fought her way through a gate and stumbled onto a porch, hammering on the door with a fist she could no longer feel. The door swung open. A big man with wild hair and cautious gray eyes stood there, holding a rifle. He looked as rough as the land around him. "Who in the blazes are you?" he demanded. "Ruth Calloway," she gasped, leaning against the door frame. "You sent for me. The driver. He's dead back on the road, and my daughter. She's dying in my arms. Please, I need your fire." The man, Jesse Hawkins, saw the small blue face tucked inside her coat, and his hard expression broke. He stepped back. "Get in here. Now!" Ruth rushed past him to the fireplace, laying Emmy down on the hearth. "I need more wood on the fire," she ordered, her hands too frozen to work right. "And warm water, not hot, and broth if you have any." Jesse moved with surprising speed, stoking the fire and getting supplies without a single word. As Ruth gently undressed her daughter, Nora appeared in the doorway like a little snow-covered ghost, clutching their bag. She stared at the strange man, her eyes full of mistrust. Jesse saw her, and his shoulders tensed up. He looked from Nora to the child by the fire. He was doing the math. "Your letter," Jesse said, his voice low and tight. It said you were alone. Ruth met his hard gaze. I know what it said. I lied. I had to. No man is going to answer a letter from a woman with 2 little ones in tow, especially not in winter. Jesse's jaw clenched. He looked at Nora, who flinched and hid behind her mother. That tiny movement changed everything. The anger in Jesse's eyes softened into something else, something protective. He knelt down and spoke directly to the little girl. I ain't the man who hurt you, he said gently. This is my home, and nobody gets hurt here. You understand me? Nora just watched him, saying nothing. Jesse let them stay. The blizzard raged for days, but inside the small cabin, a family started to take shape. When spring finally thawed the land, trouble came riding in. A man appeared on the horizon. It was Silas. He had a cruel smile and ownership papers for the children in his pocket. Jesse met him on the porch. They ain't going anywhere, Jesse said, his voice calm as a Sunday morning, but his hand resting near the shotgun by the door. You see, I've decided to adopt 2 daughters, and I protect what's mine. Silas laughed, but it died in his throat when he saw the look in Jesse's eyes. He turned his horse around and rode away, and they never saw him again. That summer, Emmy's laughter filled the valley, and Nora learned to smile again, trusting the big, quiet man who taught her how to ride. Ruth finally found her home, not in a place, but in the quiet strength of a good man. And she learned that sometimes a lie born from love can lead you right to the truth. Emmy made a small sound, and life flooded back into her cheeks. Ruth felt her daughter's forehead, warmer, stronger. Jesse watched her work, rubbing the girl's tiny hands with a skill that spoke of long practice. My grandmother was a healer back in Missouri, Ruth said, not looking up. Taught me what she knew. We ain't had a doctor for 30 miles since before the snows. Then she looked him square in the eye. I can doctor, I can cook, keep your books, sew, and make this ranch run better than it has since your wife passed. These are my daughters, and they ain't negotiable. You take me, you take them. That's my offer. Jesse just stood there, staring at the woman on his floor. She had nothing. She was at his mercy. And here she was, laying down the law. What was her name? Ruth's question cut through the silence. Jesse stiffened. What? Your wife? What was her name? Margaret, he answered, his voice tight. 14 months ago. Childbirth. The baby, too. Ruth's eyes closed for a moment. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, he bit out. Be what you promised. He pulled his coat from a peg. Room's at the end of the hall. It has a lock. As he opened the door, a blast of cold air shot through the room. Where are you headed? Ruth asked. Horses need seeing to. And I need to figure out what in the hell just happened to my life. He paused at the door. And Mrs. Calloway? We'll be talking about that lie you told real soon. The door slammed shut, leaving Ruth with a breath she felt like she'd been holding all the way from Missouri. Her body ached from the cold and the journey, but Emmy was breathing deep and warm. Nora, her other daughter, sat beside her. He's mad, Mama. He's got a right to be. But he gave us a room with a lock. Uncle Silas took our lock, Nora said softly. Ruth pulled her close. This ain't Uncle Silas's house. After a long quiet, Nora spoke again. Mama, I'm hungry. A ghost of a smile touched Ruth's lips. All right, little one. Let's see what this cowboy keeps in his kitchen. She gently laid Emmy by the fire and got to her feet on legs that felt like jelly. The kitchen was a wreck. It was clear that for 14 months a man had been living here alone with his grief. Dirt and neglect covered every surface. But Ruth found what she needed. Bread that was hard but not spoiled, butter from a cold box, and a jar of preserved peaches. Margaret's work, most likely. She set a plate on the floor for Nora. Eat slow now. The girl attacked the food like a wolf. Ruth made herself eat too. She needed her strength for what was to come. Through the window, she saw a lantern glow in the barn. Jesse was out there, likely talking to his horses. Men did that when they had heavy thinking to do. After they ate, she took the girls to the room Jesse had mentioned. It was small, but the bed was made with a clean quilt. And on the door was a solid brass lock, freshly oiled. He had prepared for her. He knew she'd need it. She tucked Emmy in, and Nora climbed in right beside her. "Are we going to stay, Mama?" Nora whispered. Ruth sat on the bed. "I'm going to make us so useful he won't be able to imagine this place without us. We're putting down roots this time, baby. Roots don't blow away." With the door locked, Ruth finally let herself tremble. Not from the cold, but from the terror she'd been fighting for 6 long months. They had made it. They were safe in a house with a fire, with a man who, for all his anger, had carried her sick child into the warmth. Tomorrow, she would start earning their keep. She would clean his house and cook him the best breakfast he'd had in 14 months. She would prove she was worth the trouble. Tonight, she just breathed. From the bed, Emmy mumbled a single word in her sleep, the first she'd spoken in months. "Warm." Ruth covered her mouth and cried silently. It wasn't much, it was everything. Outside, the blizzard howled. Inside, a fire crackled. The lives of 3 desperate females and 1 grieving man were balanced on a razor's edge. Ruth Calloway had built a life on less. She would do it again. She woke before the sun, eased out of bed, and went to the main room. The house was freezing. She coaxed the fire back to life. In the daylight, the kitchen looked even worse. She set coffee to boil, and without a second thought, rolled up her sleeves and plunged her hands into a basin of cold, greasy water. She was scrubbing a skillet when she heard boots on the porch. The door opened and Jesse walked in, his arms full of firewood. He stopped cold when he saw her. "Well, you are up," Jesse said, his voice quiet. He saw the firewood stacked neatly and the clean dishes drying on the counter. Coffee was already brewing. Ruth stood there in the same dress from yesterday, her hair tied back with a scrap of cloth. "You look like you have been up for a while," he told her. "You nearly died out there last night." "Nearly does not count," she answered, drying her hands. "And this kitchen of yours nearly died a long time ago." He almost smiled at that. "Margaret kept it better." "I am sure she did," Ruth told him. "Now sit down. I will have breakfast ready in 10 minutes, if you have got any eggs. The chickens are in the coop. Tom usually collects them. Tom is our ranch hand, a boy of 19. Good worker, does not say much." Jesse pulled out a chair but did not sit. "He is out checking on the driver. We will have to bury Bill Mercer once the ground thaws." The back door swung open, and a tall, thin young man came in, stomping snow from his boots. He stopped cold when he saw Ruth. "Tom, this is Mrs. Calloway." Jesse's tone was flat. "She will be staying with us for a while." Tom glanced from Jesse to Ruth and back again before nodding. "Yes, sir, ma'am." He left the basket of eggs and hurried out, forgetting to close the door behind him. "He is just shy," Jesse said. "You told him you were expecting 1 woman," Ruth pointed out, "and I showed up with 2 children in a blizzard." "I have not mentioned the children yet." "Well, you better. Before he walks in and drops a whole basket of eggs." Jesse finally took a seat. Ruth cracked 6 eggs into a skillet. The old stove was fussy, but she learned its ways quick enough. Anger made her efficient, and right then she was furious. Furious at the lie she had to tell, and at the world for making it necessary. She put a plate of eggs and toast in front of Jesse. He stared at it like he had forgotten what a real meal looked like. "Thank you. Do not thank me. Just eat." Ruth leaned against the counter with her own coffee. She would not sit with him. She had not earned that right yet. When he was done, he wrapped his hands around his cup. "All right, Mrs. Calloway, your daughter is safe. You are fed. Now it is time we talked." Ruth set her cup down. "Ask your questions. Why did you lie to me?" "Because I was desperate. I thought the truth would cost my girls their only chance at survival." "You were right. It would have." Jesse's voice was hard. "I wrote that advertisement for 1 woman. Someone to help around the house and maybe, down the road, to be a wife. I was not looking for a family." I lost a child, Mrs. Calloway. A baby girl. I buried her and my wife in the South Field 14 months ago. I swore I would never go through that kind of pain again. His knuckles were white on the coffee cup. And now you have brought 2 little girls into my house without so much as a word. He was right, and that made it hurt worse. You could have left us on the porch, she said quietly. In a blizzard? With a sick child? Jesse sounded offended. What kind of man do you think I am? I think you are the kind of man who mentioned good character in his advertisement instead of demanding someone young and pretty. That is why I chose you, Jesse. You were looking for a person, not just a pretty face. The fire crackled in the silence. That does not make the lie acceptable. No, it does not. And I will not make excuses for it. Ruth hugged herself tightly. But my daughters Nora and Emmy are not up for debate. If you want us gone come spring, we will go. But they go where I go. I am not sending anyone out in the middle of winter. Then we have some time. Let me prove my worth. Give me until the spring. Let me show you that we are not a burden. Jesse got up and walked to the window, his back to her. The little one, Emmy. What happened to her? Why does she not talk? She talks, but only in whispers, and only to her sister Nora. Why? Ruth's throat felt tight. After my husband died, his brother Silas took the house. He wanted us out. He would come into our room at night and stand over our bed. He would threaten to take the girls if I did not leave. Jesse turned around fast. He never laid a hand on them, Ruth said quickly. I made sure of that. But Emmy heard him night after night, a big man yelling in the dark. One morning, she just went silent. Nora says she still talks when they are alone. Last night, she whispered the word warm. That is the first real word I have heard from her in 3 months. Jesse's face was like stone holding back a storm. Where is this Silas now? In Missouri, as far as I know. He has no idea where we are. Does he have a legal claim on those girls? The question she had been dreading. He is their closest male relative. He could try to take them, say I am an unfit mother. But you are not. You are employed. Her eyes met his. Am I? For the winter, Jesse said. We will figure out the rest later. It was not forgiveness, but it was a start. A small noise made Ruth turn. Nora stood in the hallway in her nightdress, holding Emmy's hand. The little one peeked out from behind her sister. Mama, Emmy is hungry. Ruth started toward them, but Jesse spoke first. He knelt down slowly like he was approaching a scared colt. He spoke right to Nora. There is eggs and toast on the stove. Your mama made it for you. Do you want to come eat? Nora studied him carefully. She was sizing him up, noticing the rifle by the wall and that his hands were open and calm. We can get it ourselves, Nora said, her voice firm. We do not need your help. I know you do not need it, Jesse replied gently. I am offering it. That is what folks do for each other in a house. They offer help. Nora thought about that for a moment. Then she marched to the table, pulling Emmy along. She climbed into a chair, and Emmy sat beside her, so small her chin did not even clear the tabletop. Ruth brought them each a plate and sat with her girls. Jessie stayed by the fireplace, giving them their space. Nora ate quickly, with one arm protectively around her plate. Emmy ate slow, as if she had to relearn how. These are good eggs, Nora admitted. Better than what we got at the church. Jesse grabbed his hat from a hook by the door. I will be in the barn for most of the day. Tom and I will be back before dark. He stopped in the doorway and looked hard at Ruth. He said, You will find flour and salt in the pantry, and there is dried beef down in the cellar. Margaret put up preserves last summer. They are on a shelf in the back. He said his dead wife's name with no feeling at all, like a man testing thin ice. He told her if she needed anything else, to ask Tom when he came back. I will manage. I know. He put on his hat. I have seen your brand of stubborn before. Is that a compliment? She asked. I have not decided yet, he said. And then he was gone. A swirl of cold air was all that was left. Nora looked at her mother. He is still mad about the lie. Yes. Are you going to say sorry again? No. I am going to show him what sorry looks like. Words do not mean much, Nora. Ruth started gathering plates. Finish your food, then we get to work. And they worked. Ruth went at that house like it had done her wrong. She scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees while Nora wiped down every shelf. She scoured the old stove until it shined. She found Margaret's carefully labeled jars of strawberry, peach, and plum, a monument to a future that never came. She left them right where they were. By noon, she started on the mending pile. It was mostly simple stuff, like split seams and missing buttons. She sat by the fire with the basket, listening to Nora read from a book of animal stories. Little Emmy sat on the floor, drawing on a piece of brown paper with a bit of charcoal. Ruth watched her daughter's small hand make careful strokes. A shape appeared that looked like a house, with a chimney puffing smoke. It was this house, this fire. Ruth's hands stopped their work. She watched Emmy make something brand new out of nothing, and she felt a crack of hope in her chest. "That is beautiful, Emmy," she said in a soft voice. Emmy kept drawing, her hand moving a little faster. She added a small person next to the house. Then she added another small person and a bigger one. 3 people standing together. Nora leaned over to see. "That is us, Emmy. That is me and you and Mama." Emmy just nodded. Then she drew one more person, bigger and standing all by himself. "Who is that?" Nora asked. Emmy whispered something so low Ruth could not hear it. Nora looked up at her mother with a strange look on her face. "She says it is the cowboy man. She says he looks cold all alone out there." Ruth looked at the drawing a long while. It was a 4-year-old's map of their world, a man on one side of his own home and his guests on the other. "Maybe tomorrow," Ruth said, "you could draw him a little closer to us." Emmy looked straight at her mother, her big brown eyes saying everything she could not. Then she looked back down and drew a single line connecting the lonely man to the little group. It was enough. Jessie and Tom came home at dusk, stomping snow from their boots. Jessie stopped dead just inside the door. The floor was clean. The dishes were gone. A pot of stew was warming on the stove, making the whole house feel alive. The mending basket was empty. He just stood there, taking in his own kitchen like he had walked into the wrong place. "Well, I will be," Tom said under his breath. "Sit down," Ruth said from the stove. "Dinner is ready." Tom sat right down, but Jessie moved slower. He hung his hat and coat, and his eyes found the spot where the mending pile used to be. He saw the clean floor and his coffee cup, washed and sitting on the shelf, exactly where Margaret always kept it. "You did not have to do all this," he said, his voice low. "Yes, I did." Ruth served the stew. "Eat before it gets cold." Nora watched Jessie like a hawk while Emmy drew in the corner by the fire. Jessie took a bite of the stew. Something in his face changed. He took another, and then one more. "This is the best thing I've had since—" He stopped himself. "This is good." "Margaret's preserves helped," Ruth said. He tensed up when he heard the name, but he nodded. They finished the meal in silence. After, while Ruth was washing up, she said, "I found something in the back room. A small cradle made of cedar." Jessie went completely still. "I did not move it. I just wanted you to know that I saw it. You made it for the baby. Don't. You are a fine carpenter. The work is perfect." I said, "Don't." His voice was frayed and torn. Ruth turned from the sink. His head was in his hands, his shoulders hunched like he was waiting for a hit. She dried her hands and sat across the table from him. She did not touch him. She was just there. "I am not going to pretend it is not in this house, Jessie. You lost a wife and a child. That sorrow is in every corner. I cannot clean around it. What do you want me to say?" "Nothing," Ruth said. "I am carrying my own losses. We can carry them alone. or we can be honest that they are there with us. Jesse finally looked up. His eyes were red. You are a hard woman, Ruth Calloway. I am a woman who has survived. There is a difference. He just stared at her, this stranger who refused to ignore the very things he had been hiding from for 14 months. He should have been angry, but underneath it all, he felt a strange sense of relief. The cradle stays, he said at last. Of course it does. And those preserves. Use them. She made them to be eaten, not to collect dust while people are hungry. Ruth nodded. Then I will use them well. Jesse stood up and pushed his chair in. At the hallway, he turned back. Mrs. Calloway. Ruth, if I'm going to be cooking your food and mending your clothes, you can call me by my name. Ruth, he tested the word. That's stew. Margaret made one like it. Yours was different, though. I found some dried thyme, she said. It was good. Different, but good. He paused for a moment. I will see you in the morning. He left down the hall. After the dishes were done, Ruth went to check on her girls. They were asleep, curled up together. Emmy was clutching her charcoal drawing. Ruth gently took the paper and looked at it in the moonlight. The house, the family, the lonely man, and the line between them all. A line drawn by a little girl who could not speak but knew how to reach out. Ruth held the drawing to her chest. Outside, the snow had finally stopped. Stars burned bright and cold in the sky. She thought about Jesse, alone in his room, and the perfect empty cradle he had built with his own 2 hands. Being a mother means your heart never quite settles, especially when you're on the run. Ruth Calloway lay awake, thinking about her little girl Amy's drawing. Just one single line connecting a lone man to her little family. What does it mean when your 4-year-old who's scared of her own shadow around men draws a picture like that? It's a story about how you build a life from nothing, one day at a time, and whether kindness from a stranger is enough to outrun the past. Ruth figured she'd done it before, and Lord willing, she'd do it again. The days started to pile up, buried in snow and silence. Weeks went by. Ruth kept her promise, cooking and cleaning and making that little ranch house feel like a home. She learned the quirks of the old stove and made bread from scratch since they were snowed in good and proper. Jesse, he kept to himself mostly. They'd talk about fences and feed at supper, but that was about it. He hardly spoke to the girls at all, and a wide, quiet space grew between them. But Ruth was a watcher. She saw the extra firewood he left by the door each morning. She saw the little wooden horse he carved and left on the table for Emmy to find. She even saw him teaching her boy Tom how to make porridge one morning when she'd been up all night with a sick Emmy. He never said a word about these kindnesses, and she never let on that she saw, but she tucked each one away. Then on the 15th morning, little Nora took things into her own hands and marched out to the barn to face Jessie herself. She was supposed to be collecting eggs. Instead, she found a conversation. Your horses are looking a mite lean, Nora said, standing there with her egg basket. Jessie glanced up from the bridle he was fixing. That's just winter weight. They always do. Mama says animals get thin when folks don't feed 'em right. Well, your mama has an opinion on most things. She's usually right, Nora shot back, walking right into the barn. She stopped by a stall, and when the horse inside lowered its head, she jumped back. He won't bite, Jessie said softly. That's Dutch, gentlest horse in Wyoming. I'm not scared. No, I can see that. You're not scared of much, are you? Nora turned to him, her eyes old for a little girl. I'm scared of some things. Like what? Like men who act nice at first, and then they stop. Jessie put the bridle down. He didn't move, just sat on a hay bale and watched her. Your uncle, he said. It wasn't a question. He brought us candy, Nora said, her voice flat. Called me his pretty girl. Then he stopped bringing candy. And he started coming into our room at night. I'm telling you this so you know, she said, lifting her chin. I know how men work. So I'm watching you, Jessie Hawkins. I see what you do when you think no one's looking. Jessie sat there for the long, quiet moment. And what have you seen? Nora thought about it. You leave firewood so Mama doesn't have to go out in the cold. You carved Emmy a horse because you know she's scared of you. You eat whatever Mama cooks, even when the beans were burned last Tuesday. They weren't that burned. They were pretty burned, she insisted. You also talk to your dead wife at night. I hear you through the wall. The hint of a smile on Jesse's face disappeared. I ain't spying, Nora added quickly. The walls are just thin. I think it's sad. She hugged her basket tight. I talk to my daddy sometimes, too. I tell him I'm trying to keep Mama and Emmy safe, just like he asked me to. Jesse's voice was raw when he finally spoke. That's a heavy burden for a child. I'm not a child. I'm the strong one. You can be both, Jesse said, leaning forward. Listen to me, Nora. I am not your uncle. I'm not going to act all friendly just to turn mean on you later. This is who I am, this quiet and this careful. What you see is all there is. My Uncle Silas used to say that, and I reckon he was right. So you just keep an eye on me. You watch me all winter if you feel the need. If I ever do a single thing that makes you or your little sister feel scared, you tell your mama and you tell me. We will fix it. Is that a deal? Nora, all of 7 years old, stood there in that stranger's barn, carrying her father's dying words like a stone on her shoulders. Ruth would have cried to see her trying to decide if she could ever trust another man. Jesse just stood there and waited. Finally, Nora said, Deal. But I'm still watching you. He gave a small smile. I'd be mighty disappointed if you weren't. That night, Nora moved her chair one seat closer to Jesse at the dinner table. Nobody said a word about it, but everyone saw. The third week brought warmer weather and a horse. Ruth heard the sound of hooves on the packed snow and looked out the window. An old woman, bundled in so many blankets she looked like a walking quilt, was riding a gray mare right up to their porch. Jessie came out from the barn. Hattie, what in the world are you doing out in this weather? Checking on you, you stubborn old mule, she hollered back. Tom's boy told me you had a woman and kids out here. I figured I'd better come see for myself before the whole territory started gossiping. The old woman slid off that horse easier than you'd expect. Help me inside. My bones feel like ice. Jessie took the horse as Hattie stomped up the steps and pushed the door open without even knocking. She found Ruth in the kitchen, a ladle in her hand and little Emmy clinging to her legs. Lord have mercy, Hattie Perkins said, pulling her gloves off. So you're the one who answered his ad. I am, Ruth said, her voice clear. And these are the children he didn't know were coming. Honey, out here, news is the only thing that travels fast. Hattie moved toward the fireplace, holding her old hands out to the flames. I'm Hattie Perkins. I live about 6 miles west. I was Jesse's neighbor before his first wife passed. And I was a mail-order bride myself 42 years ago, so don't you think for a second I'm here to judge you. Ruth felt a tightness in her chest just let go. Would you like some coffee? I'd rather have whiskey, but coffee will do just fine. Hattie sat down and saw Emmy peeking out from behind Ruth's skirts. And who is this little mouse? That's Emmy. She's 4. She doesn't say much. Doesn't or won't? Hattie asked gently. Ruth paused. Won't. She's been through some hard times. Hattie just nodded, like that answered a question she hadn't even asked. She looked right at Emmy with kind eyes. You take your time, little one. The words will find their way back when they feel safe. Nora came out from the other room, a book in her hand, sizing up the visitor. Who are you? I'm the nosy old woman who lives down the road, Hattie said with a grin. Who are you? Nora Calloway. I'm 7, and I can read. Good for you, Hattie said. Most men out here can't claim that. She looked back at Ruth. That one has some fire in her. She does, Ruth agreed. She's going to need it. Hattie's voice got low and serious. Now you listen to me, Ruth. I didn't ride 6 miles in the freezing cold just for a friendly chat. I came to warn you. Folks in town are already whispering. An unmarried woman and a widower, living under the same roof with 2 children nobody's ever seen before. The talk is starting, and it will turn ugly if you don't get out ahead of it. I've handled gossip before. Not like this, you haven't. Out here, your good name is how you survive. If the church-going women decide you're improper, they will shut you out completely. No help when a baby's coming, no doctor for a fever, and no credit at the store. And if anyone learns you lied to get here, they will use it to tear you and Jesse both down. Ruth put a coffee cup on the table, a little harder than she meant to. So what are you suggesting? Marry the man, Hattie said plainly. Make it legal before the spring thaw brings the busybodies knocking. A marriage certificate makes you proper. It gives you legal rights. It makes those little girls his responsibility in the eyes of the law. Hattie leaned in closer. And it makes it a whole lot harder for anyone to take them away from you. Those words hit Ruth like a bucket of ice water. She'd been so focused on just getting through each day that she hadn't thought about the law. An unmarried woman with no protection, and Silas somewhere out there with a blood claim to her girls. Does Jesse know about the man you're running from? Hattie asked. I told him about Silas. Does he know Silas could come for these children? He asked if he had a legal claim. I told him the truth. Then he's already thinking on it, Hattie nodded. Jesse is quiet, but he ain't stupid. He knows what a marriage would do. He's just too proud or too scared to say it first. It's a tough spot, I get that. But if you're a married woman, if them girls have a stepfather with a ranch and a good name in this county, that man has no claim, I know that much. Then you know what I'm fixin' to say. Ruth sat still as stone across from him. Say it anyway. Jesse's jaw was tight, his big hands spread flat on the table. I ain't askin' for a wife. I'm not askin' because of some romantic notion. I'm askin' because those two little girls in there deserve to be safe, truly safe in the eyes of the law. And the only way I can give them that is to make them my own. You're proposing a marriage. I'm offering protection, my name, a legal shield for you and your girls. In return, you keep on running this house, seeing to things, being what you've already been to us. Ruth's eyes stung, but she held back the tears. What about Margaret? Jesse looked like he'd been struck. What about her? You loved her? You still do. I hear you talking to her through the walls at night. How's a dead woman supposed to feel about you marrying a stranger? Margaret would tell me to quit being a damned fool and do the right thing. Jesse's voice broke just once. She was a practical woman. She'd look at them girls and say, Jesse Hawkins, you protect 'em. That's a man's job. And that's all this is. Protection. It's all I can promise you right now. Ruth just looked at him, this hard-headed, heartbroken man. A man who carved toys for a child that was scared of him and left firewood on the porch without a word. I have my terms, Ruth said. Name 'em. The girls will call you what they want. You don't ever push 'em, especially Emmy. She'll come around on her own time, or not at all. Done. I keep my room until I say otherwise. A marriage on paper don't make it a marriage in the bedroom, not till we're both ready. Agreed. I wouldn't have it any other way. And one last thing. Ruth leaned in. You stop saying you're sorry to Margaret's memory for going on with your life. She's gone, Jesse. She'd want you livin', not half buried with her. Jesse went quiet. The fire popped and hissed. From the back, they could hear Nora's clear voice reading to her sister. That's a mighty hard thing to ask. Everything worth doing is hard. You said that to me about ranchin'. It's true for livin', too. He sat there for a long time. Finally, he reached his hand across the table, palm up. It was a calloused, scarred hand, steady as a rock. A hand that had built this house, buried a wife, and pulled her own daughter from a blizzard. She placed her hand in his. When the road's clear, Jesse said, a circuit preacher comes through. We'll do it quiet. Just us, the girls, and Hattie for a witness. That's all we need. Ruth. His grip tightened on hers. I can't promise I'll love you. Maybe not ever. I don't know if I have it in me anymore. I'm not asking for love. I'm asking for honesty, for safety, for a chance to build something that matters. Can you give me that? I can try. Then I'll try too. They sat there, two people making a deal that wasn't about passion but about survival. It was the kind of courage you find when you've lost it all and there's one last thing worth fighting for. Nora's voice drifted in, telling a story about a lost bear who found shelter in a stranger's den to wait out the winter. On a scrap of paper, Emmy was drawing the house again. But this time, the fourth little figure was no longer off by itself. It had moved closer. The circuit preacher, a wiry fella named Reverend Amos Crane, came through the first week of March. Jesse met him at Hattie's place and brought him to the ranch. Ruth dressed the girls in their best clothes. Nora wore a blue ribbon Hattie had given her, looking serious and grown up. Emmy clutched her little wooden horse in one hand and her sister's in the other. Ruth wore Margaret's dress. She hadn't meant to. She found it folded in a trunk, a simple cream-colored cotton dress. It fit her perfectly, which felt like some kind of omen, good or bad she couldn't say. Jesse saw her and just stopped, the color draining from his face. "I can change," she said quickly. "I should have asked." "Don't." His voice was thick with emotion. She'd want it worn. She'd hate for it to sit in that trunk. Hattie showed up with honey and a look that said she was ready to cry. Tom stood by the hearth looking proud and out of place with a handful of wildflowers he'd found somewhere. The whole ceremony took maybe 4 minutes. The preacher said the words. Jesse said, "I do." His eyes locked on Ruth. Ruth said, "I do," looking right back at him with a mix of fear and gratitude. "You can kiss the bride," the preacher said. Jesse leaned in and she met him halfway. It was a quick, careful kiss, a deal being sealed. "Well," Hattie said, wiping her eyes, "that's that. Ruth Hawkins." The name felt different, lighter. They all ate dinner together around that table for the very first time. Tom told a funny story about Jesse pulling a cow out of a snowdrift. Hattie told about her own wedding 42 years ago. Nora let out a real laugh, and Emmy looked up from her drawing to watch her, like she was trying to remember how. Later, after everyone had gone and the girls were asleep, Ruth stood in the hall between their two rooms. "I meant what I said," Jesse told her from his doorway. "Nothing changes unless you want it to. I know. Good night." "Jesse." "Good night, Ruth." Two doors closed, but the space between them already felt smaller. The weeks that followed found a quiet rhythm. Jesse came in from the barn earlier. He'd sit at the table while Ruth cooked, just being there. He answered Nora's endless questions about the ranch. He never pushed Emmy, but he left little things for her where she'd find them. A smooth river stone, a piece of charcoal for her drawing, a second wooden horse to keep the first one from getting lonely. Emmy never said a word of thanks, but Ruth saw the drawings change. The fourth figure was always standing with the other three now. One day, Ruth found a picture where they were all inside the house and the chimney was putting out so much smoke it filled the whole top of the page. "She draws what she wants to be true," Nora told her one night. "The smoke means the house is warm. She wants it to be warm all the time." "It will be," Ruth promised. "I'll make sure of it." But she knew that promises were easy to make and hard to keep, especially with men like Silas out in the world. Jesse came in then, shaking snow from his hat. When he saw Hattie, his face went carefully blank. "You two been talking?" "We have," Hattie said sweetly. "About the weather?" "Like heck you have," Jesse grumbled. "Hattie, whatever pot you're stirring, just leave it be." Hattie stood and pulled on her gloves. "I'm not stirring. I'm stopping a wildfire before it starts. I've said what I needed to." She looked at Ruth. "That coffee was the best I've had all year." Then she looked at Jesse. "You're an idiot, but you're a decent one." And to Nora, she said, "You keep reading, little girl. Knowledge is the one thing no one can ever take from you." After she left, the house felt empty. "She told you we should get married," Jesse finally said. "She told me I needed to protect my daughters. With Hattie, that's the same thing. Is she wrong?" Jesse looked at Ruth across the table, this woman who had changed his whole house in just 3 weeks. "If Silas comes," he said, his voice low, "if he finds you here unmarried, any judge in this territory would give those girls to him. But the law doesn't care about what's right. It cares about what's on paper." He filed this before we were even married, Jessie said, looking at the letter. Before I legally adopted the girls. Does our marriage change things enough? Ruth asked, her voice trembling. I don't know. We need a lawyer. We can't afford one. We'll afford what we have to, Jessie said, and his voice turned to steel. Nobody is taking those girls from this house. Not while I'm standing. Ruth just stared at him. This was the same man who hadn't wanted a family just a few months ago. Now he stood there, ready to fight for daughters that weren't his by blood. You mean that? She whispered. I've never meant anything more. Jessie, this could get ugly. Silas has money. Then we'll get ugly right back, he said. I've got this ranch, a marriage certificate, and a little girl who can tell any judge what kind of man Silas Calloway really is. I won't make Nora do that. You might not have a choice, Ruth. That old, familiar fear crept back into Ruth's heart, the one she thought she'd left behind in Missouri. The fear that a man's money and name would always mean more than a mother's love. Ruth, Jessie said, stepping closer. Look at me. She did. When I married you, I married those girls too. Nora with all her fire, and Emmy with her drawings. All the broken pieces of your family are my family now. They're mine. He took the letter, and she read the cold, legal words that called her an unfit mother. It said Silas knew right where they were. How? She asked. Hard to say. Someone talked, Jessie said. We need to tell Nora. Not yet, he said, his voice gentle but firm. Let me talk to a lawyer first, then we'll tell her. Together. That word, together, felt strange and new, but it also felt like hope. The next morning, Jessie rode into town and came back with a name, Arthur Blaine, an attorney who handled everything from stolen cattle to stolen children. Jessie said their best hope was a lawyer named Blaine, who owed him a good turn from a fence dispute 3 years back. But the other news he brought turned Ruth's blood to ice. There is a man in town asking questions, Jessie said, his hat still on his head. A young fella from Missouri. He's asking around for a woman named Calloway with 2 little girls. Ruth sank into a chair, her legs no longer willing to hold her. Jessie figured it was a hired man, sent to find them before Silas made his next move. They had only days, or weeks at most. What are we going to do? Ruth whispered, her hands trembling. We get out ahead of it, Jessie said, his voice firm. Blaine is filing a petition tomorrow. It will have our marriage, my legal adoption of the girls, and Hattie's testimony about you being a good mother. We will build a solid wall he cannot knock down. And if he does? Jessie's voice was low and sure. Then I will stand between him and our girls. My good name in this territory means something. When I tell a judge I will raise those girls right, that carries a whole lot of weight. It had better carry more than Silas's money. But somehow Nora found out anyway. The truth always had a way of finding that girl. Ruth walked into the bedroom and found Nora on the bed holding the letter. Her face as white as a sheet. Where did you get that? In Papa's coat pocket. The word struck Ruth like a fist. Papa. In all these months, Nora had never called Jessie a single thing. Now, with this threat hanging over them, she called him Papa. Is Uncle Silas coming to take us away? She asked in a small voice. Ruth sat beside her. He is going to try, honey. But we will not let him. He will say awful things and folks might listen just because he is rich. Nora folded the letter with steady hands. Then I will tell them. I will tell the judge what Uncle Silas did. I will tell them why Emmy does not talk anymore. Sweetheart, that would be so hard to stand up in front of strangers like that. Nora's chin was firm. I have done harder things. I walked through a blizzard. I can surely talk to a judge. Ruth pulled her daughter close, feeling her fierce, brave heart beating. "You are the bravest person I have ever known, because it is always true." At that moment, the hall door opened. Jesse stood there, and Ruth knew from the look on his face that he had heard it all. His eyes went from Nora to the letter in her hands. "Did you just call me Papa?" Nora lifted her chin high. "Yes. You do not have to do that." "I know I do not have to. I want to," she said, her eyes bright. "You gave us a safe room. You carved a horse for Emmy. You married Mama to protect us, and now you are fighting Uncle Silas for us." Her voice softened just a little. "My real daddy. He would have said you are a good man." Jess put a hand against the doorframe to steady himself. This quiet man who kept so much locked inside. "I will do everything in my power," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Nobody is taking you from this house." Nora walked right up to him and put her arms around his waist. It was the first time she had ever done so. His hands, uncertain for a moment, came down to rest on her shoulders. He held her like she was both precious and strong, and Ruth watched them through a blur of happy tears. A little noise came from the corner. Emmy was standing there holding a wooden horse tight to her chest. She watched her sister hugging the cowboy. Her eyes were wide and dark with a feeling Ruth just could not place. Emmy walked slowly across the room to Jesse's side. She reached out, and her little fist grabbed two of his fingers. She looked at Nora, not at him, but she did not let go. Jesse looked down, and his whole face just broke open like frozen ground in the spring. His voice was torn up when he spoke. "Well, I reckon that settles it." Emmy whispered something so soft you could barely hear it. Nora heard, though, and said through her tears, "She says you are not cold anymore." Jesse closed his eyes, his big hand gentle around Emmy's tiny one. "No," he said. "I suppose I am not." That night, Ruth stood in the hall. She looked at Jesse's door, then at her own, and made up her mind. She knocked softly on his door. When Jesse opened it, he was still in his clothes, just his boots were off. He just looked at her, waiting. "I am tired of sleeping alone," Ruth said. "Not from fear. I am just tired of having doors between us." Jesse stepped aside and Ruth walked in. The room was simple and neat, the bed made perfectly. A picture of Margaret sat on the dresser. "She is beautiful," Ruth said, turning to face him. "I am not trying to replace her. I am just here. For you." Jesse's hand trembled a little as he tucked a piece of hair behind her ear. "I am not good with words, Ruth. Margaret always said I kept things walled up." "Then let me in," she said. He kissed her then. It was not a careful kiss like at their wedding. This one was full of need and truth, of sadness and thanks. It was the terrifying hope of feeling again. Ruth kissed him back with all the hope and fear she had been holding inside. "Stay," Jessie said against her lips. "I am staying," she promised. Tonight and all the nights to come. Lying in the dark, with Jessie's arm wrapped tight around her, Ruth listened to the wind howl. The fight with Silas was coming. She knew it in her bones. Jessie spoke into the quiet. "Whatever happens, I need you to know something." She waited. "I didn't come to Wyoming looking for love. I came here to survive. You gave me both." She pressed her hand flat against his chest. "I love you, not for marrying me or for keeping my girls safe. I love you because you're the kind of man who carves a wooden horse for a scared child and just waits for her to find it. You've spent 14 months shutting the world out, but you're learning to let us in." He was quiet for a long spell. Then his arm pulled her closer. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough, like the words were hard-won. "Fought it every single day. But you showed up with 2 frozen children and a half-true story. And you made everything better. You made me better." "We made each other better," she whispered. And they had. Tomorrow, the fight for her children would begin. But tonight, she was loved. Her daughters were safe. And she was home. Ruth had learned that home isn't a place you find on a map. It's a thing you have to build, nail by nail, with someone brave enough to build it with you. Silas Calloway showed up on a Tuesday morning. Ruth was at the kitchen table with Nora going over numbers when she heard the horses coming up the road too fast. One look out the window and her blood ran cold. She would know him from 200 yards away. The way he sat a horse was just like his brother Henry. "Nora," she said, her voice steady, "take Emmy to the back room and lock that door, now." One look at her mama's face was all it took. Nora grabbed her sister's hand and they were gone. Ruth took off her apron, folded it neat, and walked onto the porch to wait for the devil to ride into her yard. Silas pulled his horse up 10 feet from her. He was thinner, his face harder than she remembered. The man beside him was older, a lawyer wearing a suit under his duster. "Ruth," Silas said with that snake oil smile of his, "country life agrees with you. Get off my land, Silas." "Your land?" He swung down from his horse. "Last I checked, this place belongs to a man named Hawkins. You're just the hired help who got a ring on her finger." The lawyer dismounted. "Mrs. Hawkins, my name is Gerald Pwitt. I represent Mr. Calloway in the matter of his nieces." Just then, the barn door slid open. Jesse came out with Tom right behind. He walked across the yard without a hurry in the world, but his right hand hung loose and ready. Tom circled wide, putting himself between the house and the visitors. They had planned for this day. "Mr. Calloway," Jesse said, stopping beside Ruth on the porch. Their shoulders brushed. "You're on my property." Silas's smile never wavered. "And you're harboring my nieces. I'm their uncle, their own father's brother." "Their mother brought them somewhere safe," Jesse said, his voice level. "From what I hear, safe wasn't a word used much in your house." The smile finally flickered. "I don't know what stories she's been feeding you." "She left," Jesse said, cutting him off, "because you scared her 4-year-old daughter into silence." "Emmeline was always a quiet child," Silas snapped. Ruth's voice sliced right between them. "She was not quiet before you. She used to sing every single morning, Silas. She has not sung one note in 8 months, and you are the reason." "A court will decide," Silas sneered. "Then let's let a court decide," Jesse said, and he stepped off the porch to stand on the same ground as Silas. Jesse was a bigger man, but it wasn't his size that made Silas step back. It was the absolute certainty in his voice. "I legally adopted those girls. They carry my name. This ranch is their home, and their mother is my wife. You do not come to my home and threaten my family." The lawyer, Pwitt, stepped forward. "Mr. Hawkins, no one is making threats. We are here to assert Mr. Calloway's rights." "His rights ended when he terrorized his family out of their own home," Jesse replied. He looked straight at the lawyer. "You want to serve papers? Take him to Arthur Blaine on Main Street. He's expecting you. But this conversation is over. You will not see those children today." "I have a court order," the lawyer insisted. "You have a piece of paper from Missouri. We are in Wyoming territory. Your paper doesn't mean a thing here until our judge says it does." Jesse paused for a beat. "I checked." For the first time, the lawyer looked rattled. Silas turned that awful, possessive glare on Ruth. "Those are Henry's girls. They belong with their family." "They are with family," Ruth said, moving to Jesse's side. "You were never their family, Silas. You were their nightmare. And if you come near them again, I will tell every judge from here to Washington exactly what you did. I will tell them every word you said standing over my bed at night." The mask on Silas's face cracked just for a second, and she saw the pure rage underneath. But they were standing in broad daylight with Jessie beside her and Tom behind her, and her daughters were safe behind a locked door. "Get on your horse," Jesse said, his voice low and final. "You do this the legal way, or you don't do it at all. But if you come back on my land without a marshal, I'll treat you like any other trespasser." The lawyer took Silas's arm. "We should go." Silas shook him off. He stared at Ruth with the cold fury of a man who believes he owns the world and can't believe he's been told no. "Henry would be ashamed of you," he spat. Henry would have killed you for what you did to his children, and you know it, she shot back. Silas mounted his horse, and they rode away without a backwards glance. Ruth watched them go until they were nothing but dust. Then her knees gave out, and Jessie was there, catching her. Easy. I've got you. He won't stop, she whispered into his chest. Then neither will we, Jessie said, his arms a solid wall around her. He walked onto our land, Ruth, and he left without those girls. That's a win. Is that enough? I'm not going to quit, he said. That's enough. Arthur Blaine got right to work filing papers and gathering statements. Hattie spoke so fiercely they had to ask her to quiet down. Tom told the court how beat down Ruth and the girls were when they arrived. The Reverend Crane even wrote a letter about their good character. Jessie sold 10 head of cattle for the lawyer fees. When Ruth tried to argue, he just said it was already done. The hearing was set for June. For 3 days after the notice came, Ruth could not eat. Jessie found her late one night, just staring into the dark. Tell me what is wrong, he said. What if his money is enough to win? What if they take my girls back to that man? Then I will ride to Missouri and I will bring them home, he said flatly. Jessie, I am serious. So am I. Those girls are not going back there. If the law will not protect them, I will. You would break the law for them? They are not your blood. Blood is what hurt them, Jessie said, his voice hard as iron. They are mine because I choose them. Every single day I choose them. Ruth took his hand. The quiet man she first met was gone. Grief had silenced him, but love was giving him his voice back. The courthouse was in Cheyenne, a 2-day ride. Leaving the girls with Hattie was tough. Nora would not let go of Ruth's hand. I should be there to tell them what he did, she insisted. Honey, you wrote it all down for the judge to read. It is not the same, Ruth knelt down. I know, sweetheart, but my job is to protect you from having to face him in that room. Please let me do my job. Nora's lip shook. What if you lose? Then I come right back home and we figure it out together, like we always do. I promise. Emmy stood behind her sister, clutching her 2 wooden horses. She tugged on Ruth's sleeve and whispered in her ear. A moment later, Ruth walked over to Jessie at the wagon. Emmy has a message for you. What is it? She said, do not let the mean man win. She says you are her papa, and papas do not let mean men win. Jessie grabbed the side of the wagon so hard his knuckles turned white. He took one long breath, then another. Then he turned, walked to Emmy, and knelt down right in front of her. Emmy came down the steps real slow, one at a time. She placed her little hand in his, her eyes the same shade of brown as Henry's. I will not let him win, Jessie promised her. That is my solemn vow to you, Emmy Hawkins. She squeezed his fingers, then let go and hurried back to Hattie, hiding her face. When Jessie stood up, Ruth saw a look on his face she had never seen. It was the look of a man who had found his reason to fight and was at peace with it. It is time, he said. The courthouse was packed and stifling. On one side sat Silas with his lawyer and 2 men Ruth did not know. Ruth and Jessie sat on the other with their lawyer Blaine, who was steady and capable. The judge was a gray-bearded man named Walter Crane, who seemed to listen more than he talked. He examined every piece of paper. Nora's written words, 4 pages of them, were so chilling they made the clerk's hands tremble as he read them out loud. Silas's argument was about blood and money. Blaine's was about truth. He called Ruth to the stand. She told them everything, her voice as even as when she taught arithmetic. The screams in the night, the unlocked door, the day Emmy went silent. Through it all, she never cried, and she never once looked at Silas. Then Blaine called Jessie Hawkins to the stand. Jessie walked to the front of that court in his good shirt, holding his hat. He told the judge about a woman who appeared in a blizzard carrying 2 shivering children and a secret. He spoke of Emmy's lips, blue with cold, and how he brought her to the fire. He remembered Nora in the barn, telling him she was watching his every move. He described carved wooden horses and simple drawings. He told them how a little 4-year-old girl whispered the word warm, as if it were holy. "Those girls came to my home as strangers," Jesse said, his voice filling the room. "They will leave it as my daughters. I watched them heal. I saw them learn to trust again after the man meant to protect them shattered that trust. I watched a 7-year-old girl carry her whole world on her small shoulders." He looked straight at the judge, the man who held their future in his hands. "I am not a perfect man, Your Honor. I talked to my wife, who has passed. I work too much. I did not even want children, but wanting something and choosing it are two different things. I chose these girls. I choose them every single morning and every single night when I check on them to make sure they are sleeping sound and safe." The judge looked down at Silas Calloway, his voice steady. "I have read everything, the statements, the testimony, all of it. Now I have one question for you, and I expect a straight answer. Did you go into your dead brother's wife's bedroom after dark on several occasions, trying to frighten her into leaving the family home?" Silas scoffed. "It was my property. She was a squatter." The judge's eyes narrowed. "That is not what I asked." Silas's jaw tightened. "I might have been firm. It was an emotional time for all of us. And did the little girl, Emmeline, stop talking right after these visits started?" "I do not know when the child stopped talking. I was not keeping track of her." The judge gave a slow nod. "No, I reckon you were not." He went back to his chambers, leaving Ruth and Jessie sitting in silence. Ruth gripped her hands together so hard they went numb. An hour that felt like a lifetime later, the judge came back. "Petition for custody is denied. The children will stay with Ruth and Jesse Hawkins. Furthermore, Mr. Calloway, you are to have no contact with them without written permission from both parents. Any violation means you will be in contempt of this court." A breath Ruth did not know she was holding finally escaped. Under the table, Jessie found her hand and held on tight. "This is not over," Silas declared as he stood up. "It is in my courtroom, Mr. Calloway," the judge shot back. "Now I suggest you go back to Missouri and mourn your brother the right way instead of making his children miserable." Silas marched out without a look back, his lawyer scrambling behind him. The moment the door shut, Ruth felt the tears come. Right there in the courthouse, Jesse pulled her into his arms and just held her. Words were not big enough for what they were feeling. "Let us go home," Jesse finally said. 2 days later, they crested the last hill as the sun was setting and saw the ranch spread out below. Smoke curled from the chimney. On the porch, 2 tiny figures stood watching the road. Nora saw them and grabbed Emmy's hand, and they both took off running. Nora scrambled into the wagon before Jessie even brought the horses to a full stop. "Did we win, Mama?" she yelled. "Did we win?" "We won, sweetheart. We won." Nora hugged Ruth so tight she could barely breathe. Jessie climbed down and stood in the yard as little Emmy looked up at him. "Hey there, little one," he said gently. Emmy lifted both her arms, the way a small child does when she wants to be held. Jessie scooped her up and settled her against his chest. She laid her head on his shoulder and wrapped her tiny arms around his neck. "Papa," she said. It was not a whisper. It was a clear, strong word that everyone could hear. Jesse squeezed his eyes shut as tears streamed down his face, the first he had shed since he buried his own family. He held Emmy close while Nora pressed against his leg, and Ruth wrapped her arms around them all. That evening, after the girls were asleep, Ruth found Jesse on the porch. "Emmy spoke," she said quietly. He nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I know. I will hear that word for the rest of my days." Ruth leaned her head on his shoulder. "Jesse Hawkins, 3 months ago you told me you did not want children. 3 months ago, I did not want much of anything," he said, turning to her. He cradled her face in his rough hands, his eyes finally clear of old grief. "Now I have more than a man could ever ask for, and I will spend my life trying to be worthy of it." "You do not have to earn it, Jesse. You just have to keep choosing it." "Every day," he promised, and then he kissed her. In their room, Nora listened to the quiet of a house that was finally safe. She hugged her sleeping sister close. "We are home, Emmy," she whispered. "We are really home." On the floor, a drawing lay in the moonlight. It was the house, with 4 people standing together. No space between them at all. Above their heads, in big wobbly letters, was a single word she had helped her sister spell: family. Ruth had come to Wyoming with nothing but 2 scared daughters and a desperate plan. Now she stood on her own porch with a husband who loved her and a home nobody could ever take from them. This was not some fairy tale. This was real life, built on grit and courage. It was about a woman who walked through a storm because stopping meant giving up. It was about a good man who opened his door when it would have been easier to keep it shut. And it was about 2 little girls who showed the grown-ups what true bravery was. The ranch was peaceful under a sky full of stars. The lock on the bedroom door was no longer needed. Ruth breathed in the cool night air, knowing she was exactly where she belonged. She had fought for this life. She had built it from the wreckage. And it all came down to 2 simple words a 4-year-old had given her like a gift. Warm. Papa. That was more than enough. That was everything. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.